Hello, everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about a couple upcoming assignments, discussion board reactions, and then go into Adlerian theory. So just to start with assignments, the APA exam is going to be due on the 30th, and that's for the 7th edition of the APA manual. So you need to read sections 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. Those ones are specifically emphasized in the exam. I know some of you have already taken it, but for those of you who haven't, those are the sections to emphasize. That's also in the learning modules. When you click on APA module/exam, it'll have the sections to emphasize. You have up to 3 attempts, and only the highest score is recorded in the grade book. So if number 2, you get 95, you retake it again the third time, get a 92 for some reason, the 95 will go in the grade book. If you have questions about the APA exam, please let me know. Also, I want you to start thinking about the personal values and counseling reflection paper. So it's just trying to capture what are your beliefs at this point in time. And there's basically 5 kind of core areas that you'll be reflecting upon. And I did just update the syllabus to have a max of 5 pages for that paper. So that might feel like a lot for some, that might feel like a little for others. So but try to stick with that 5 pages, no more than 5 pages. And if you're kind of struggling because you're going beyond that, I think it'll be an important process to really kind of condense your thoughts and really focus on what's most central. Yeah, so it'll just kind of capture your beliefs at this time, that paper, and that can change, and it likely will throughout your time in the program. That's normal and okay. All right, so a few discussion board reactions. I want to encourage you all to emphasize the theoretical language when you're doing these case studies. So the case of Nicole, we're going to keep using Nicole as a case study for the different discussion boards that we're going to be doing for the different theories. So we're going to consistently be referencing back to Nicole. So use the theoretical language, and many of you did that really well, but just try to emphasize that. Get used to, like, how can I make sense of what's happening for a client from various different theoretical perspectives, and how can I use that language to make sense of what's happening for the client? Because if you start to understand from a theoretical lens what's happening for the client, then you'll better start to understand, okay, based on this theory, how do I intervene to help? And just one point of clarification with psychodynamics, sometimes transference was brought up a lot, which is great and really important in psychodynamics. Sometimes there's almost reference as like transference is used, like I use transference with the client. Transference is more like a reaction that the client experiences towards the counselor. So it's not that we can, like, oh, I'm going to use transference today. Transference is, it's kind of something we can respond to it. We can interpret it from a psychodynamic perspective. But it's really just that relational process that the client might start to exhibit certain, previously developed relational tendencies towards the counselor. So it's really something where the counselor can start to use immediacy, can start to use those core counseling skills of reflecting meaning and reflecting feelings to kind of get to the core of that unconscious process and highlight that transference reaction and explore it more depth to increase the insight for the client. But yeah, I just wanted to clarify that it's not necessarily something like we cannot necessarily use it and force it on the client. We respond to it as it emerges. And abuse was brought up, because of Nicole's resistance to exploring, or kind of the, Nicole just basically didn't address the abuse history. So remember that abuse, particularly sexual abuse, really needs to be a process at the pace of the client. It's not something to be forced from the client, or excuse me, from the counselor, and to like meet the counselor's needs and timeline of how they think the client needs to progress. But that's a really sensitive area that the client needs to have a lot of say in how they proceed in that area. So I just wanted to highlight that at this point, that it's really important to honor the client, particularly in situations of abuse. Obviously, different theories are going to be a little bit different of how much directiveness they take, but I'd still encourage and kind of push that this is an area where, even if someone's a little more directive or a theory is a little more directive, that you can invite topics to be explored, but pushing them is a very different thing. Okay. Uh, and I just wanted to highlight that good work in the end with the discussion boards. It's kind of like, I think for a lot of you, it's the first time of trying to apply a theory to a counseling client, to a session. And it's going to just be kind of an overview, trying to make sense of the concepts, starting to conceptualize the theories and apply them to a client. So uh, I think that's, it takes time to really delve into it. And right now we're just kind of scratching the surface in some ways. We're just kind of going over a lot of the core principles and the theories, and there's a lot more to explore. So this course kind of opens your mind to a lot of possibilities. And then later on, you can explore more significant depth in the theories that really resonate with you. Oh, and just to clarify, the last thing is that I won't require you to apply future information that we haven't yet discussed to any assignment. So, for example, like I'm not going to say, hey, in this discussion board, I want you to cover something like in a theory that's like in the future for the class. So, just to clarify, like we're all in the discussion board post where we're applying the theories to Nicole's case. It only applies to the modules that we're covering that week. I'm going to make that clear in the language in the discussion boards, but I just wanted to verbally state that as well. Okay, at this point, I created a video previously on Adler, so I'm going to switch that video. You'll see a different Kirk in just a moment. Thanks. All right. At this point, I'm going to cover a few thoughts on Adlerian therapy. So what I'm going to do is just kind of, obviously, I've talked about this previously, but I just wanted to highlight again that I'm not covering every single tiny little detail of the approach. I'm just going to kind of highlight some important core ideas, as well as maybe some of the interventions that can connect back to those core ideas and core philosophy. So that's kind of the purpose of this video. The readings will kind of go into a little more detail. I'll highlight some things from the reading and then just some other thoughts. All right, so some of the core constructs from Adlerian. First off, this idea of personal power. That word isn't necessarily always used that way. Let me grab the text here. So on page 99, around the inferiority feelings section, it kind of relates to this idea of personal power. And the reason why I'm using this idea of personal power is sometimes people reference Adler as, this having this basic will to power. Freud was saying this, will to pleasure, and as a basic core human instinct. And Adler was basically saying, no, not really. It's more a will to power. But this idea of power, it's not like power over others necessarily. It's more just like this inner power, this power of developing the self, developing the potential of the self, so the growth of the self. So that's kind of this how power and personal development is seen. Uh, so yeah, this idea of inferiority feelings is actually really connected to personal power, because inferiority feelings has to do with, it's not necessarily seen as a negative thing. It's saying like, I am not what I could be, so I can grow creatively towards what I can be and what I ought to be, kind of towards who I am or the vision of myself that I want to have. So that's kind of the idea of that. We can move from a place of inferiority to, potential. So that's part of that inner drive as humans, according to Adler. And we develop this idea of private logic. That's talked about on page 106 of the Corey text. So private logic is described as, the concepts about self, others, and life that constitutes the philosophy on which an individual's lifestyle is based. Once again, on page 106. So we start to develop this inner framework or philosophy of who we are. How are we basing our life on what foundations are we basing our life? And sometimes that can lead to faulty logic if that philosophy if there's problems with how it's developed, if there's flaws in how we view self and how we view others, then that can lead to this faulty logic, as it's talked about in this approach. So all of this private logic and this impulse to develop and move towards potential and personal power, personal competence, leads to one style of life. It's on page 101, it talks about how it's like a roadmap of life. So the client starts to develop this direction. So yeah, I see all of that as kind of related to personal power, that there's inferiority is related to personal power. The private logic kind of helps inform our sense of personal power. Sometimes there might be the faulty logic, which holds us back from that potential. And then it all kind of helps develop this philosophy of life. So choice is also very important, kind of really honoring the client's choice, and honoring them as the creator of this style of life, this roadmap of life. So it's almost like helping this client find this autonomous direction that is personally significant and meaningful. Adler also talked about how pro-social this approach is. That there's this idea of social interest, and the key goal, actually, one of the key goals of Adlerian counseling is to help the client to develop social interest, to care about others, to care about, the community that the client's a part of, and to seek to be a productive and positive influence in that environment, in that social group. So the tasks of that, some of the three basic tasks that Adler talks about is, that we have these social tasks of kind of belonging, connection to friends, kind of developing these relationships, then love, kind of more that intimate, close relationship, as well as occupational. How can we give back to society through an occupation, through work? So these three tasks are kind of related to that pro-social orientation that oftentimes elements of the style of life or the roadmap of life for the client is going to integrate this social, love, and occupational, these tasks and themes. Additionally, this approach is pretty holistically based. The client might be fragmented. It might be that they have parts that need reintegration into a whole. And that's kind of where this unconscious and conscious connection comes in. And the video demonstration will talk about that a little bit. That, the client might be kind of splitting into different parts, but then reintegrating that into like, who is this holistic whole person, and how can we honor the whole, like all the various different parts of them and see them as a whole is important. All right, so the counselor's role in this, I kind of see the counselor as an encourager, as a re-educator. The text kind of talks about how that's one of the steps in this approach is re-education, kind of helping the client come to new insights and then apply those new insights. The counselor and client are seen more as equals and as collaborators, and it seems that the counselor has a confidence in the client. Once again, that might be related back to the trust in the client's choice and in kind of the direction that they're naturally progressing and where they want to go. The counselor trusts in them to be, naturally moving in a positive direction. So some interventions that can kind of be an important part of this approach is, I guess I'll go kind of to this assessment phase. So in the assessment phase, the client might need to explore early recollections. Earliest recollections is often an important part of Adlerian. So the counselor might talk about 3 earliest recollections. I believe in the video that's what occurs too. So this is where there's kind of this unconscious or psychodynamic-like element to this approach is, who are we from a really early age, and how does that inform where we're at now? It's almost like those early recollections that are talked about by the client become almost metaphors for what they're working on presently. Additionally, part of like a holistic assessment takes into consideration those early recollections, takes into consideration also the family constellation. So understanding birth order can be an important part for the client. Where they fit in their family dynamic can often be an important part of that social organization, and that's how they make sense of their pro-social orientation. Let's see. So yeah, that's kind of part of that assessment phase. That doesn't always, the assessment's also not just at the start. Sometimes people think like you just do these intake assessments and then you move on, but that can be like a qualitative process as much as a quantitative, depending on the individual. But relationship building is essential throughout as well. So like really demonstrating empathy for the client, connecting with the client. Once again, that's part of this seen as an encourager, seen as an equal, seen as a collaborator, having confidence and trust in the client. So demonstrating that empathy and trusting them that they'll be able to gain the insight. Let's see. So as well, finding meaningful goals can be important. The video talks about that as well, the video demonstration. So sometimes, you can be collaborating with the client to figure out what are those meaningful goals. And once again, that's likely going to be reflecting back to what is the roadmap of life for the client? What is the style of life for this client? What is their positive potential direction that they're heading? And so kind of being a collaborator to help the client clarify what those are. They likely at a deep rooted level kind of have intuition of what that might be, but sometimes they don't really know what that is yet. They don't know how to word that yet. In the Corey text, they also talk about this idea of re-education that I brought up earlier. So there is an emphasis not just on insight, but on action. Sometimes there's some approaches that we're going to be talking about where insight is kind of the key goal. The assumption is if you gain insight, then you'll naturally change, or maybe you don't even need to change. You'll just kind of become your authentic self through that insight. But Adler was, we need to, sure, insight is important, but then you need to actually move. You need to do. You need to behave differently based on that insight that's been gained. I think the last principle about re-education that I want to emphasize, and just kind of Adler in general, is this idea of encouragement. Encouragement is an important part of Adler, but I do want to really highlight what encouragement can mean. Sometimes encouragement for some people, they might interpret that as like being like a cheerleader. Oh, you can do it, work hard. So they almost like feel like as a counselor, they need to be that cheerleader of sorts. But that's not necessarily what Adler's saying here. It's more so on page 114 in the Corey text, it talks about how encouragement is kind of seen at a base definition as to build courage. So to help the client build their sense of courage to kind of confront life, to step into their potential. So it's not necessarily, oh, you can do it, but to kind of help them find their intrinsic courage. So it's not necessarily something that the counselor gives to them, but they help the client build it within themselves. So with this in mind, that like there's other thoughts that we could, elaborate on, but I think the key to this is, in the text, I can't remember the exact page off the top of my head, but one point that I wanted to make is that for Adlerian, as well as a lot of theories, it's not as much the interventions or the techniques that make you Adlerian. Because you could be integrating approach or interventions from different approaches and different theories, but still be able to work from an Adlerian philosophy or framework. Because it's more like if you're working from this philosophy of kind of viewing this building of personal power, looking at the style of life, encouraging that autonomy, kind of having this holistic lens, looking at the client's private logic and their inferiority feelings. If you're kind of making sense of the client from that philosophical framework, then if you use other interventions from other approaches, but you're still doing them so that you can help the client, for example, with their style of life, then you're still Adlerian. You're still kind of aligning with an Adlerian philosophy. So I just really wanted to highlight that once again, because I think sometimes, especially beginning counselors in training, is like the emphasis can really be on, oh, what intervention? What do I need to say exactly to help the client change? But then you're kind of, if the emphasis is on the intervention without really understanding, but why? Why am I using this intervention? How does it relate back to a core philosophy of what would be helpful for the client? And sometimes the interventions can just kind of be sporadic, kind of trying different things without any coherence and connection. So yeah, I just wanted to really emphasize that. And in your pre-practicum, when you come to labs, we're going to be talking about, how to use the core counseling skills, the core, skills of paraphrasing, reflecting meaning of it, kind of tending to nonverbals, using immediacy, etc. Some of these core counseling skills, they're really central to every single theory. They're going to kind of surface in unique ways, but with all theories. So just really wanted to kind of highlight that point because, like I said, the core emphasis is how do I make sense of the client? And then the interventions flow from that. Okay, those are my thoughts on Adler. So I look forward to another week with you all. And yeah, we'll see you next week.